very proud to serve as Texas State Director of American Atheists. Although my activism doesn't always advocate atheism specifically, I do my best to promote science, skepticism, and secular values. Because the religious right has done a lot of damage in my state over the last several years to the economy, the environment, and especially to education. Texas textbooks have seen several subtle changes made to intentionally enhance and endorse the position of Christian conservatives. In social studies, the influence and interests of white Protestant Christian historic figures are emphasized against a backdrop of country music, while the concerns and contributions of all minority groups are largely ignored or even edited out of the history books. In health class, misinformation is allowed to run rampant, especially with regard to anti-vaccination and belief in faith healing. There is no sex education in Texas. Condom use is reportedly discouraged, and the official policy is to teach abstinence only. Consequently, we have one of the highest rates of teen pregnancy and the highest rate of repeat teen pregnancy. This is because our current governor and your future president, Rick Perry, repeatedly appointed right-wing religious fundamentalists to chair the State Board of Education in a state where the Republican Party actually says they're opposed to teaching higher-order critical thinking skills, which of course will only perpetuate the problem and keep people like Perry in power. Imagine how science suffers in an environment like that. Ideologues held the majority of the board, and they voted as a bloc to effect whatever changes they could get away with. They knew they couldn't promote their religion in the classroom and teach that as historic fact, though there are state-funded schools in Texas that are doing exactly that anyway, due to a loophole that was opened in the lesson plan for religious studies. They still can't teach it in science class. They can't promote creationism using that label or intelligent design either. But they live in a society that thinks that anything that is not explained by science is explained by God. Thus, to denigrate science is to promote religion. So they repackaged creationist arguments as scientific weaknesses of evolution. Things like, evolution is not observed. Unobserved events of the past are outside the realm of science. Life is too complicated to come about by random chance. Mutations cannot add new information to the genome, and no one has ever found a transitional fossil, and so on. These and many others they try to insert into the biology and geology textbooks. My first endeavor as an activist was in response to that and was an attempt to teach evolution to the members of the Board of Education who most needed an education in that subject. I failed, and I'm not at all surprised that I did. A couple years later, the dentist whom I failed to reach had summarily dismissed the combined testimony of about 100 scientists, saying, I disagree with these experts. Someone's have to stand up to experts. That is how our Board of Education became a source of international embarrassment. As a result, that dentist was voted off the board, replaced by somebody who apparently does understand science. And while there are still plenty of creationists exerting their influence over that board, the next review of the TEKS, that's Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, went very differently. I was one of the next 100 or so science advocates who testified in 2011, and at that time, the board adopted sound science standards which allow for very comprehensive discussion in cosmology, the ages of the geologic column, and all aspects of biological evolution. So how did Texas react to these improved standards? With disapproval, of course. A few weeks ago, my wife and I met with Houston atheists to picket the state conference of the Texas Homeschool Coalition because they support teaching politicized religious extremism instead of anything that is actually true or useful. This coalition consists of mostly religious fundamentalists who took their kids out of public schools not to educate but to indoctrinate, specifically to prevent them from being taught evolution so they could be fed misleading creationist pseudoscience instead, along with a lot of mumbo-jumbo and other topics as well, because the problem isn't just ignorance of evolution, but the rejection of scientific methodology in general in addition to all the other twisted ideologies which the Christian right wants to push onto another generation. You can't advocate policies promoting public education in science, sex, social studies, health care, immunizations, gay rights, ethnic and gender equality, women's reproductive rights, criminal justice, capital punishment, agricultural bioengineering, environmentalism, or even ethics without confronting and combating religion, which seems to exist only to impede, restrict, retard, or reverse progress on all fronts. Religion always presents the first and biggest obstacle to any attempted improvement, even when we try to defend freedom of religion, because that involves and necessarily must include freedom of inquiry, investigation, exploration, and analysis. These things require freedom of thought and belief, and that necessarily means that belief systems, which have required beliefs and prohibited beliefs, cannot be imposed or enforced. That is why there can be no freedom of religion without freedom from religion. Students of exclusively faith-based instruction will likely never understand that, nor much of anything else either. Because their ultimate guidebook isn't just wrong scientifically and historically, it's also wrong ethically and morally. Religion is so wrong about so much, and this is so obvious that it often requires impressionable children to be completely immersed in a relentless, methodical mental conditioning to the omission of all other knowledge, positions, and philosophies in order to make the nonsense stick. That is what exclusively religious instruction is all about, and it begins at the beginning with the sciences dealing with origins. So the Texas Education Agency has good standards for understanding mainstream science. I gave a speech at the Houston Museum of Natural Science wherein I summarized each of the relevant teams, showing how good the standards actually are, and to summarize what sort of lessons we should expect accordingly. The problem is, and my audience of Texas residents confirmed this, public schools will not teach this subject as directed. An estimated 20% of our teachers are creationists and refuse to teach the lessons honestly. Most of the remaining teachers don't understand it well enough to teach it correctly. And those who do usually want to avoid confrontations with religious parents or students who may have been trained to disrupt the class whenever they sense that their preferred beliefs are threatened. So instruction in evolution is often avoided as if there were a legitimate controversy. The irony is that if you live in Texas and you want your children to learn evolution properly, you have to take them to homeschool then too. And there are several science-savvy families who do that for that reason. There is an online network of secular homeschoolers in Texas, but of course they weren't welcome at the conference we went to. Several of the attendees at that conference wondered why we were there, why we cared what other people teach their children. Of course, they're only thinking in terms of their faith, that they want to teach that there is a God. They think we want to teach that there is not one. And of course, that's not the real issue. The issue is that the information they're teaching is wrong. You may as well tell your kids that the moon is made of green cheese, or that Columbus discovered Ohio in 1942, or that the Sonoran Desert is an example of climate change that was caused by deforestation brought about by Paul Bunyan. It's that wrong. They're manipulating and misrepresenting the information such that they're misleading and deceiving their own kids. And some of these parents are so completely conditioned by their lifelong programming that they don't even realize that's what they're doing to the next generation too. But many of the leaders of the creationist movement are pretty clearly doing that on purpose. One of the keynote speakers at this conference was Ken Ham, a young earth creationist running a science denial website called Answers in Genesis. He said many times that facts may be dismissed or ignored whenever they conflict with the assumed authority of Scripture. Now think about what that means. Can that even be an honest position? The data he does acknowledge, that which he says is supportive of his position, has either been deceptively presented, deliberately distorted, or fraudulently fabricated out of whole cloth. It is not factual. Remember that a fact is a point of data that is either not in dispute or is indisputable in that it is objectively verifiable. So Ham chooses to ignore what can be proven to be true. He may think of facts as inconvenient truths, but the truth is what the facts are. Anything more is interpretation. Anything else is speculation and should not be asserted as true. Regardless how you intend to interpret the facts themselves should be real, meaning they should be verifiably accurate and represented truthfully. That is rarely the case in any of the creationist articles or seminars. When they're not ignoring the evidence, they're lying about it. They have to eventually, because it is not possible to defend creationism honestly. At some point, very early on, they'll be forced to make a choice, whether to remain honest or whether to remain creationist, because they can't continue to be both if the conversation goes on. Ken Ham often compares creationists to sensible people, saying that we're both looking at the same evidence, we're just interpreting it differently. But that's not true, because he's already admitted, and I now know from experience, that he will not look at the evidence I have to show him, and he doesn't have any of his own for me to look at. If the same fact suits two different mutually exclusive conclusions at the same time, then it is not evidence of either one, it's just a fact. For example, the fact that the universe exists at all does not imply a creator simply because you call it creation. I call it reality, but that doesn't mean there's a realtor. So the mere fact that there is something rather than nothing cannot be considered evidence of, nor could it be explained by, the mystic incantations of any magic invisible genie. By definition, facts cannot logically be considered evidence until they are concordant with and indicative of only one of the available options over any other. Ken Ham may have finally realized that, as he has recently posted a video wherein he implicitly admitted that there is no evidence of creation. There is only the Bible, a compilation of man-made mythology which believers imagine to be the Word of God. Given the content of the Bible, the constant contradictions, absurdities, atrocities, inconsistencies, immorality, inhumanity, insanity, ignorance, and irrelevance of the various fables, parables, psalm lyrics, and pseudo-porn contained therein, I don't see how any reasonable person could believe that the Bible could have been composed by a competent being, much less a superior one, and certainly not one worthy of worship. I find nothing to imply that, and no reason to believe it, but that's only my opinion. And that, again, is not the reason we chose to make it that event. The reason was that the lessons they teach are factually fraudulent, and accuracy matters if you're going to teach it under the guise of education. We consider it immoral to teach children to believe things which are not evidently or apparently true. When you're talking to religious people about their religious beliefs, you'll find that whatever the truth really is doesn't matter to them. There is no interest in accountability because measurable accuracy is impossible. They may say that they believe in absolute truth, but they're just affirming their faith. It is a total lie. Their worldview is one of pure imagination, where self-deception is so precious that the truth is irrelevant. It comes down to whatever you want to believe rather than whatever we can actually show to be true. And Ham exemplifies that. For example, when we were out there in the heat holding our picket signs demanding factual accuracy, we were given pamphlets criticizing science. They were trying to find fault with things they didn't understand well enough to even know how to refute it, even if it was really false. They made claims that didn't matter because they weren't true, and wouldn't matter if they were true. Disproving evolution can't save creationism. Even if a God appeared and started poofing things out of nothing, that still wouldn't prove the Bible, because that collection of contrived and plagiarized fairy tales has already been disproved beyond redemption, and not even the existence of God could change that. They also gave us religious tracts telling us how Jesus loves us and what conditions we have to meet in order to be saved from his unconditional love. Again, tracks were completely empty because there is no truth to them. Nothing to indicate that any of this contradictory nonsense is even real. Belief is a conviction. That means I have to be convinced. So there has to be something to show that it is true, or it cannot be considered truth. That's why the scientific method requires logical or evidentiary prerequisite to all postulations. As a scientist, you can't say that anything is true until the evidence shows that it is. You can't even say that something is probably true until you can show the data indicating that probability. You can't say that anything is possible either, not without providing a precedent or parallel showing that possibility, or proving that a particular phenomenon plainly happened anyway, regardless of whether we can yet explain it. And despite how the Bible defines it, a fool is one who too readily believes the improbable claims of incredulous people. It is never wise to believe anything said by another without reservation, without question, without reason. Otherwise, you'd be fooled into believing anything. For example, here are some of the claims found in similar pamphlets distributed in another country outside of our familiar mythos. Our dear, faultless, and gifted Supreme Leader, our Father, the central brain sent from heaven, and Son of the eternal President, was born in a log cabin on a sacred mountain. His birth was foretold by a swallow and heralded by a double rainbow. At the moment of his birth, winter instantly changed into spring, and a new star appeared in the heavens. News of his birth was carved into trees and soon written into rocks all across the country. He never had the need to urinate or defecate, and the weather behaved according to his mood. Even in his infancy, he was already a genius. He learned to walk in just 3 weeks and talk at 8 weeks. As a schoolboy, he corrected and chastised his teachers for their incorrect interpretations of history. While at university, he wrote 1,500 books and composed 6 operas, all of which are better than any in the history of music. The first time he went bowling, he scored a perfect score of 300. The first time he picked up a golf club, he played one round that was 38 under par with 11 holes in one. It was the greatest golf game ever, so he retired from the game. He had great success at everything he did. He invented the hamburger. Look how popular that was. Not only was he an accomplished engineer, an invincible military master, and a communications expert who could coach winning soccer teams using an invisible transmitter, he was also an unprecedented director, composer, and choreographer, as well as a fashion icon whose trend-setting style was in vogue the world over. He was a great champion of justice and peace, and his diplomatic skill made him the envy of everyone. On the tragic day when our illustrious commander, born of heaven, the lodestar of the century, the Generalissimo, died, the skies glowed red above the sacred mountain, and an impenetrable sheet of ice in the heart of the mystic volcano cracked with a deafening roar. And a crane, the symbol of longevity, was seen circling for hours around the statue of the eternal president before flying off to the capital city. There, thousands of mourners gathered for hours, convulsing in unison, all of them overcome by inconsolable grief. And what I just read to you is not the questionable testimony of anonymous authors thousands of years ago and decades after the fact, talking about some guy with no historic record who evidently never even existed. Some of what I'm talking about was actually televised in living memory. It was reported on the news by the Korean Central News Agency and detailed in the official biography of Kim Jong-il. I'm not kidding. Look it up. And get this. We can prove that Kim Jong-il was a real person. Look at the concordant documentation. We're talking about national news, official historic records, and recent events you can watch on YouTube right now. That's much more proof than there ever was for Jesus. So if that doesn't convince you to believe in the powers of Kim Jong-il, And how could you possibly expect me to believe your ancient fables of talking snakes and golems? Any claim that requires faith should be rejected for that reason. There has to be a reason to believe it because only accurate information has practical application, so it cannot be a valuable lesson if it isn't true in some sense. If you're asserting it as knowledge of science or history, then if it isn't true, it's worthless. So how do you know if a claim is true? The same rule should apply to everyone. You take your challenge to the one making and repeating the claim and you say, show me the truth of it. When someone asks me, why do scientists say this? If it's a subject I know, I can show them the evidence indicating that conclusion and only that conclusion and reinforcing that conclusion. I can show them hundreds of transitional fossils, probably whatever specifically they're asking for. I can show them that even macroevolution has been directly observed and documented dozens of times in laboratory experiments. I can show them genetics research showing specifically identified mutations that actually do add information and increase complexity. I can even show them where RNA spontaneously generated itself accidentally in a simulation of natural conditions in a prebiotic Earth. But when creationists ask me these sorts of questions, they don't want to know the answers. They don't want to know there is an answer. So they interrupt that answer to ask another question, and they interrupt that answer to ask another question until they get to the point where I don't know the answer. And then they say, aha, you don't know. And then they pretend like they do know. Here's the problem with that. They ignore the fact that science provided every answer up to that point. And they ignore the fact that religion failed to provide any answer up to that point or beyond it either. So we follow a trail of what science knows and religion doesn't know until we get to a point where science doesn't know and religion still doesn't know. Knowledge is justified belief, and that's the popular definition, not just mine. So it doesn't matter how convinced you are. If you can't confirm your accuracy to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then it is a fact that you cannot actually know what you think you know. This is especially true when there are hundreds of millions of other people claiming to know things that can't be true at the same time as the things you believe. No matter how many people claim infallible knowledge of absolute truth, if they're all talking about mutually exclusive beliefs, then only one of them can be right, but, and this is far more likely, every one of them could still be wrong. We have a colloquialism in the South to describe someone who speaks with confidence about things he can't prove or doesn't really know. We say he's talking out of his ass. Except when he's talking about religion. Why make the special exception? They should have to put up or shut up like everybody else. We don't have to prove which religion's right. There's no indication any of them are. Atheists don't have to prove there's no God. Science doesn't have to prove there's no God. There is only what is supported by evidence and what is not supported, and whatever is not supported doesn't warrant serious consideration. Come back when you've got something of substance. Don't tell me what you believe. Tell me why you believe it. Yes. Don't tell me to meditate on it or to ask God for it, because these methods give random wrong answers of every imaginable kind, probably because they are imagined. So it's not enough to admit that other believers got things wrong. Show me how you got anything right. How can I know that? Even if God exists, even if it is the Bible God, and even if God wrote the Bible himself without the influence of human mediums, the authority of the author is not enough. There would still be outside evidence from the natural world to back it up. It wouldn't be that everything everywhere always indicates that, no, this is the man-made mythology of madness, mayhem, and misogyny. It doesn't matter what you believe. All that matters is how accurate you can show your claims to be. And no faith-based belief system can show any accuracy at all. How do we tell the invisible from the imaginary? They look the same to me. They can't even show that there's a there there. So when they ask me to show the truth of my position, I give it to them. When I ask them to show me the truth of theirs, they get evasive excuses, backpedaling bullshit, psychological smoke and mirrors. That's why I can honestly say there is no truth in religion. I can say that with confidence because I know the religious community will prove my point for me. Let me explain. Last Tuesday, September 17th, I testified once again before the Texas Board of Education. Once again, there were over 100 people there, including a lot of teachers, scientists, and clergymen of one sort or another. Several of them were all free at once. We were testifying as to whether we should keep the science standards as they are, or whether we should change them according to the recommendations of a team of recently nominated reviewers, some of whom were handpicked from die-hard biblical literalist organizations and the infamous Discovery Institute. Can you imagine a less appropriate board for choosing your science standards? Now, rumor has it that what has reportedly happened before is about to happen again. Textbook publishers just might once again agree to alter their texts, compromising their standards according to as yet undisclosed demands of one of their biggest customers in closed-door meetings that we won't know anything about until months from now. It has happened before. But now we're talking about virtual books instead of hard copies. So things just might turn out differently this time, because the cost of printing is no longer an issue, meaning that Texas can no longer mandate that whatever books we approve end up being everyone else's books too. We no longer have the influence we used to. So the publishers just might refuse to make any changes. That would be good, but there's another possibility too, and I like this one better. The publishers can now make a special edition just for Texas and still run the regular edition for every other state. This wasn't possible when they only made hardback books. But it means they can sell us the watered-down version and the full-body version to everyone else, and market it under the name of the science book that was banned in Texas. I think that'd be a great selling point. So anyway, we're all giving our testimonies, and there were a lot of creationists there. Many of them with legitimate science degrees, usually engineers of one sort or another, all making assertions they can't possibly back up. For example, Mark Cadwallader of Creation Moments said that many of evolution's so-called proofs and just-so stories have been soundly debunked in the past 100 years. If that were true, he would be able to cite peer-reviewed articles to prove it, but he can't. I've debated him before, and he has no idea what he's talking about. He's probably thinking of Piltdown Man, but even that doesn't meet his criteria. He doesn't even know what evolution is, and refuses to accept that it is a change of allele frequencies in a population over time. His copy of Webster's dictionary didn't define it that way, and he will not accept any scientific source. I showed him a half a dozen textbooks which define evolution the way I do, but he still said that evolution has nothing to do with genetics. He said that classroom lessons included a prerequisite of teaching religious atheism. He just wasn't able to find a single syllabus that would back him up on that. He also told me that humans can't be eukaryotes, nor organisms either, because he thinks both of those words refer to single-celled microbes. In the debate we had, he also declared himself to be a government scientist. I didn't know there was such a thing, and he complained that I used too many big words. Gary Bennett of the Center for the Preservation of American Ideals admitted that intelligent design is a branch of biblical creationism, despite the many attempts of the Discovery Institute to keep that fact a secret. So I thank him for exposing their lies about that. He proposed teaching intelligent design in public schools, and when asked what type of creationism he meant, he said, biblical truth. Now, he may have imagined a choir of angels cheering him on as he said that, but when I heard biblical truth, I thought, that's an oxymoron. Mr. Bennett, it is not truth simply because you say it's true. We can't judge it to be truth until you can show that it is true. He also thinks that evolution is a religion requiring equal time with other religious instruction. So he doesn't understand how his own faith-based authoritarian belief system, which discourages heresy, differs from an evidence-based method of inquiry and testable hypotheses in critical analysis, which makes evolution the complete opposite of a religion. But then he said, the Institute for Creation Research has compiled massive scientific evidence to support intelligent design. No, they haven't, Mr. Bennett. The Institute for Creation Research is a disingenuous propaganda mill. That's why they were denied accreditation by a unanimous vote in 2008, and that's why the judge ruled against them in 2010. Neither they nor anyone else has ever compiled verifiably accurate data which is solely concordant with and positively indicative of a magical creation according to the Bible. Dr. I. Trotter said that our textbooks were out of date because they didn't include the word neo-Darwinism. He also complained that students are told that every scientific test has supported Darwin's basic idea, that being that populations evolved through mechanisms of natural selection and that all life is related by common ancestry. Trotter says nothing could be further from the truth. No, Dr. Trotter, biblical truth can be further from the truth. Because you can't show that there's any more truth to that than we could find in the Mahabharata or the Indiana Jones trilogy. But that's just the first challenge. The second challenge is to cite even one scientific test that's relevant to evolution but which doesn't support Darwin's basic idea. I'm betting Dr. Trotter cannot meet either of those challenges. Finally, Dr. Don McLeroy, DDS, former chairman of the Texas State Board of Education and their most infamous member ever. In 2003, he said that most of the boats we were considering adopting claimed that nothing made a spider out of a rock. That's how little education he has on this subject, despite my attempts. Last week, he said, these biology books are full of unsubstantiated dogmatic statements supporting evolution. So my challenge to him is to show any statement in our textbooks which both meets the definition of dogma and which is not indicated by an inference of evidence. I doubt he could meet either of those criteria. If anyone attempts to respond to these challenges, they will fail to vindicate their claims in the judgment of peers in that field. Creationism has experienced 160 years of consistent, continuous, complete failure in all areas. I predict that trend will continue. I also predict that each of these challenges will go unanswered by the claimant being called out because they are all lies. And I suspect that each of these men already knows that. There is no truth in the claims of creation science. And there is no demonstrable truth in the claims of any religion either.